The Atlantic Slave Trade.
The Atlantic slave trade, also known as the transatlantic slave trade, took place from the 15th to the 19th century. An estimated of 25 to 30 million people, tweeted violently torn from their homelands and shipped abroad, and about 12 to 17 million African slaves were part of the triangular trade, crossed the Atlantic to produce and manufacture goods.
The triangular trade began in Europe with the shipping of weapons, textiles, alcohol, iron, and other commodities to Africa, and there they were exchanged for Africans sold into slavery, those in wars, mentally ill, or convicted of crimes. In return, these African slaves were loaded up with human cargo to set sail for the Americas, where in return they were exchanged for a cargo of sugar, tobacco, coffee, and cotton to Europe.
During the process of the triangular trade, the African slaves were going through the Middle Passage. African men, women, and children were densely packed and crammed onto ships were transported across the Atlantic to the West Indies.
The availability of slave labor on plantations in the New World has widely contributed to the economic growth of both Europe and the New World. Particularly, black slaves were very important as labor for sugar plantations in the Americas, specifically the Caribbean. This made it possible for a large quantity of sugar and other products to be produced and manufactured in Europe, thus increasing its demand in the New World market. As a result, the workforce of black slaves rapidly increased the available food in the world, which contributed to a world market of trading between the Old World and New World, and generally benefiting the world's economic growth. In addition, the transatlantic slave trade had a profound impact on Europe's economy. Many historians argue that the transatlantic slave trade contributed to Europe's industrial revolution. During the 18th century, the British became the first country to industrialize in terms of commerce and technology.
Despite the positive economic contribution of the slave trade towards the economy, it also had serious negative impacts on the African continent. The transatlantic slave trade disrupted the economic system of Africa and shifted from materials to human trading. Within a century of commerce with the West, Africa lost its economic anatomy and peace, becoming a land where warlords and chiefs of tribes hunt one another in order to sell to the Europeans. The disturbance of peace also affects the normal trading system of the continent, thus decreasing its economic growth. Even though individuals and tribes who were trading with the Europeans benefited from the transatlantic slave trade, it generally had a negative impact on the overall growth and improvement of the continent's economy. Luckily, there was a few lone voices that spoke against the trade. Trade was very profitable for Britain, which provided work, wealth, and consumer goods. The early abolitionists were the Quakers who, on June 1783, presented Parliament with a petition against the slave trade, and created public opinion to an ending of slavery. While slavery was still in the process, the most prominent abolitionists were James Ramsay, Olaudah Equiano, and William Wilberforce, which all three made one of the first acts in the abolishment of slavery. On 1759, Ramsay was a naval surgeon who boarded a slaving ship. He was horrified at the dreadful condition of slaves that were shipped to the Caribbean. He argued against the slavery and said Britain's economy would still prosper without the slave trade if only they trade products rather than people.
Equiano was captured by slave raiders and spent 21 years as a slave until his savings were enough and bought his freedom. He wrote a book where he actively campaigned about abolishing the slave trade. Wilberforce, an English politician who gave speeches in the Parliament about ending slavery internationally during the late 1700s, which reflected on Britain, but it was until 1807 the act was passed and agreed on and slavery was abolished in Britain, followed by US, Portugal, Spain, and other countries. If it wasn't for them, the fight for the slave trade would have been more difficult than it already was.